Hello everyone. İyi akşamlar herkese. Welcome Francis.
Hello Felice.
Hi. We are right on time, surprisingly.
I'm amazed. I'm stunned.
We were expecting a little delay, but it worked out fine thanks to my friends' efforts here.
Good,
welcome.
Good.
Welcome to Turkey.
It's my first visit. I like it. So it's quite beautiful.
So one little reminder before we go on, if we can both remember, this meeting is being translated to Turkish simultaneously. Our friends will do their best. So maybe a little slower conversation, if we can manage.
I think that's perfect for the topic. So.
Okay.
Yes.
I always remember your story of the rock time. So may we consciously slow down to the time of the soul.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I want to welcome you again. Now having you at this festival, I think is the fruit of an intention that was planted in 2012.
Some seeds take some time to ripen, don't they?
Some seeds do, indeed. So I am so grateful that you are here with us this evening, because you may be one of the maybe few people actually who are the reasons for this festival. So it makes so much sense to have you here tonight, and it gives me so much joy, because it was my encounter with you in 2012, and then being continuously inspired by your work in the following years, that led us maybe here. One of the main reasons. So I'm very, very grateful to you, and so welcome to you once again.
Thank you. I'm almost speechless by those words. I'm glad to know that seeds that we did throw found such fertile ground, and to see all of your faces, and to actually have a festival around grief. Oh my God, that's quite amazing to imagine celebrating that particular quality of being human. And so I want to thank you, Felice, and all of your helpers for putting this together. It's a grace for the world.
Thank you. So I want to start with a tiny story of how we met, and then I'm gonna, I have a few questions for you, as we have decided before. So it was 2012. I was on a soul journey. I was on a pilgrimage in California, amongst all places. And one of the main things that came to my attention that year on that soul journey was grief rituals and grief work. And I heard it for the first time from Malidome Some. Sobonfu Some. And I never got to meet her. I never had the chance to meet her. But her talking about grief has moved something in me, has planted something in me. And then while I was in California, I found out about your work, and then I found my way to you, to a conversation that you offered at the Commonweal Gardens. So that's where we met, and that's where I interviewed you for the first time, actually, that short period. And that stayed with me, and that has planted the seeds for grief work for me in Turkey. So 9 years later, here we are. And since 2016, I've been offering grief circles and grief rituals. In the beginning, you mentored me for a while, and that has really given me the courage to start this work here. And that was another blessing, another gift from you. And now we have a festival, And also your book has been translated to Turkish, the amazing book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. It will be published very soon, within a month. I have the news from the Butik Yayın Evi, Butik Yayıncılık. So that's all that happened within 9 years. And I just wanted to cover this cycle before we go into the questions about grief.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So, after this initial story, I want to start with your personal story of grief, and how did you actually step into this work, and what brought you into this fertile territory of grief, and how did that transform you personally?
I often say that I didn't volunteer for the position. It's like something claims you. I mean, my work has been basically soul focused for my entire life. And I had this feeling that soul, that deep quality of our own nature, comes with a certain appetite or a certain inclination towards certain territories of being human. And so I've always had a melancholy disposition. There's been something about sorrow that has been with me my whole life. And I couldn't get away from it. I would much rather be the joy guy, the happy guy, but I couldn't get away from this territory. And then, there's incidents in my life. My father had a major stroke when I was 16 years old and never spoke again. And there's multiple losses. But I think there was also the experience of having my own being kind of eroded. What I write about is the second gate of grief. We may talk about the gates later on, but the layers of my own soul, my own self, became depleted and thinned through shame, through feelings of worthlessness. So there was always this kind of heavy quality to my life, which maybe that's what drew me into becoming a psychotherapist. And then sitting with people for almost 40 years, you really begin to feel that the territory is heavy with sorrow. All of the accumulated losses from childhoods, through alcoholism, through divorces, through deaths. And we very rarely have much education in the terrain of grieving. So what becomes depression is really kind of oppression. It's sediments, layers and layers of untouched grief that just they weigh down on us. And so my work became more and more focused on how do I loosen that dense territory. And then I was introduced to grief rituals in the mid-90s. And I realized that this is one of the missing elements in the working with grief. And that's become very much a part of my work over the past 20 some years now, of bringing grief rituals across the country, Canada. So, yeah. We're in it now. Okay.
How did that change your life, actually, doing it?
Well, in some ways, it was very congruent with my life. I knew a lot about being down in the depths. And what was actually helpful was to begin to see it reflected not only in my own story, but in the stories of all the people I was sitting with, and then the people who gathered in circle. There was some sense that in my early life, that heaviness made me feel different, that somehow I didn't belong to this happy culture. We're supposed to be up, right? We're supposed to be, shining and everything's good. And I never felt like I belonged to that culture. So to have this reflection come back to me in the people I sat with and in the groups, that this is actually the undercurrent of a lot of white industrial technological culture was very healing for me. It actually emboldened me to write, to be more expressive about the necessity of our attending to this kind of abandoned part of our soul life. Yeah, that's how it was more of a confirmation than anything. Well, that's pretty radical to have your inner life confirmed by what you see in the outer world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it was an experience of belonging in a way in the world.
That's well said. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It was like an arrival. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I'm also taking conscious time of silence in between. I can't see my interpreter friends. I hope all is well there. But well, having shared a bit of the stories in the beginning, well, we often said in the grief spaces we open, me and my friend Berna here, Berna Kirkerpoljak, we often say we can't really define grief. It's one of those things that comes with its mystery, and it's almost like a deity or a being or a master, we call it. Also inspired by your expression, apprenticing to sorrow, apprenticing to grief. But before apprenticing piece, what is, I don't want to say what is your definition of grief, but how do you talk about it? And what is its function and in a human's life cycle? And especially now at this time of Anthropocene, when everything is being undone, upside down. We are in a transition period. So, yeah, what do you think? Or what do you say?
I would say that grief is the inevitable experience of the entanglement between love and loss. There is no love without loss. They are entangled from the beginning. And so if you're going to open your heart even a little to this life, you are saying basically that I accept the rights of grief. That grief is the inevitable expression and acknowledgement that something has penetrated our heart. And there will be losses, either my disappearance through death or things falling apart, things decaying, ending. So grief is the acknowledgement of the heart's affections being disrupted or changed or altered. The role of grief, particularly at this point in our story as a species, is to keep the heart open. It's our job, in a sense, spiritually speaking, to register what is happening to the ecology, to the human cultures. It's our job to register these losses. If our hearts are closed, which often happens, and again, in a grief-phobic society, where our hearts close and tighten and harden, and then the losses of the world are not being registered. And I think that's been a lot of the trouble we're in, is that we haven't really felt deeply enough into the collective sorrows of our time. So part of the work of grief is to keep the heart, the opening of the heart wide, because we are the receptor sites. We are the ones being asked to register and then to respond to the rips and tears in the body of the world. That's our spiritual obligation. If we don't do it, who will? The trees can't speak for themselves. The the ferns and the lichen and the salmon can't speak for themselves, but we can. And grief is also, I often say, is a form of protest. It's a recognition that something that matters to us is being harmed, is being damaged, it's being assaulted. And again, if my heart is closed, I won't protest. I'll just kind of endure and collude in some fashion with what is happening. So I see grief work at the heart of our emerging decades. I just wrote a preface for a book called Choosing Earth by Dwayne Elgin, and he's talking about the next decades, and perhaps I'm saying in generations, that the keynote of this time is grief. There's going to be layer and layer and layer coming upon us of grief. And if we're not skillful in being able to process this, the only option we have is to shut down and to go into what I call the two primary sins of Western society, which are amnesia and anesthesia. We will go into numbing and forgetting. And that would be disastrous for these times. I know that's a lot to translate at once, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, maybe let us take that in. The great illnesses of our time, big forgetting and big numbing. And the great value of the grief work and the work of remembering.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's kind of a wake-up call also, not only for our individual hearts, but also collectively for our species.
Absolutely. I mean, if the only thing that feels like it has a chance of changing the course of the world is our hearts breaking. Because when the heart breaks, what it's basically saying is it's registering the deep affection and deep love that we intuitively, instinctively have for this planet. I love this watershed I'm in. And it's almost burned multiple times over the past few years. We've been right up to the edge of the fire multiple times. So it is the broken heart. It's the heart that is willing to risk feeling what is happening, that has any chance of turning this suicidal pathway we're on into something potentially healing.
It makes me want to ask you, and I have some theories of my own, but why are we so afraid of the heart breaking? Why are we so afraid of grief work?
Primarily because we've been asked to carry it alone. We've been asked to kind of become a solitary presence, carrying it privately and internally. And when we're asked to do that, the weight of that grief is too much. And there's actually a wisdom in numbing. If we were open to that grief day by day and we were all alone with it, it would crush us. Yeah. That's why we gather in circle, right? I mean, that's why you're doing these circles, because we cannot process grief on our own. We can, at best, we can try kind of tread water. We can try not to drown, but we need, grief has always been a communal process. Throughout our long story as a species, it has always been communal. And suddenly in the last, at least several 500 years to 1,000 or so years, there's been a gradual forgetting of the village and a gradual movement more towards individualism and the singularity of the person. And in that setting, it's just too much to carry, so the heart closes. And that's what I've seen thousands of times in grief rituals, is watching hearts crack open when they're in the presence of that original matrix. The original context is reestablished, which is group work, group communal grieving together. When we're finally given that reflection and that permission, there's movement. In a sense, what is happening is that we're warming the material in the heart, because all on our own, the material turns cold. And when something turns cold, it hardens and congeals. And then there is no movement. And what we have to do is keep this material warm. And to do that, we need to be held by others. We need to sing together. We need to weep side by side. We need to know that I'm not alone in this. But I can see in your faces, actually I can see right now, that I'm not alone with my grief. You know, then we can risk opening back up to this difficult guest.
So maybe the beginning of our journey with apprenticing to sorrow or grief begins with finding one another first.
I think that is indispensable until we can have the permission and the reflection back to us that I'm not alone again with this. That's kind of the beginning of the apprenticeship. That's when I begin to have enough courage to take up my apprenticeship. Up until that point, I won't even touch that. I won't get near it. I'll be distracted, and I will be, swayed by, Facebook and, all the other distractions that are out there. But I won't have the courage to face my grief. And I won't have the courage to take up this apprenticeship, because the apprenticeship is basically acknowledging that grief is always present.
So now we slowly step into the apprenticeship territory. This is an old tradition in this country, on this land. There were apprentices to all kinds of crafts and art forms, and this is the way people learned and transferred ancient knowledge and wisdom. And now we have schooling and certifications and this and that. But I just love the word and the concept of apprenticing to something, to someone, which first of all tells me it's almost a lifelong duty. So let us explore a little deeper into this notion that I've heard from you. I think it's you who put these words together, apprenticing to sorrow. So can you take us into that a little more?
I'd love to. Your introduction is right, is that in many societies, the idea of apprenticing to a craft was implicit, whether it was weaving or pottery or carpentry or painting, and the idea implies a long stretch of training, it's not a weekend event. We like going to our workshops, and that's great. It's wonderful. They help us. But the apprenticeship is implying a long period of time. And I like what you said, Felice, a lifetime. And in the old traditions, to take up the apprenticeship 5, 10, 15, 20 years led to the application of the title of master. You became a master craftsperson. In soul work, this apprenticeship doesn't lead to mastery so much as it leads to elderhood. This is the training ground for elder. There's no coming to elderhood without a long apprenticeship with grief. Because that's the furnace, that's the heat That's the forge in which all of the material is cooked and tempered and refined. So the long apprenticeship implies that if you stay faithful to it, what emerges out of that is some sense of being able to be an elder to the community. And that's what we need right now, are potent, robust human adults who've gone through that apprenticeship, who could then turn and face the generations that are coming behind us and look them in the eyes and say, I see what you're carrying. I don't necessarily have answers for it, but at least I can see it and I can validate what you're experiencing. So the apprenticeship is really a long process of seasoning the soul through ongoing encounters. But to do so, we have to have certain skills. I often say that grief is not just an emotion, but it's a primary human faculty. It's a skill. And we need to be educated in this skill. And that's part of the reason why we're so afraid of it as well, is that we don't get taught. We don't see it happening in the village. We don't see it happening in our families.
Well, we don't even have a village.
We don't even have. Well, that's part
us.
that's part of our grief, isn't it? Is again how alone we have been asked to be with our lives. There's a lot more I could say about apprenticeship. Is there a particular pathway you want to go with this, Felice?
Just want to check the time. And we're good with time. You can take it as you like.
Well, this apprenticeship has certain requirements. The first requirement is learning how to come into right relationship with grief. We tend to have a kind of a binary relationship. We either push it away or we drown in it. And what we're being asked to do is to actually develop a courtship, as if grief is a companion now. You're walking with grief alongside you day by day. And if you pay attention, every day will touch you with some bit of melancholy, some bit of grief, sometimes gentle, sometimes intense and acute. But we want to be able to be in relationship to this other, this presence, as you called it earlier, this conversation, this one who walks beside us all the time. So we're not drowning in it and we're not repressing it. We're fostering a relationship with it. The second thing
right there, I would like to actually interrupt you. I'm sorry, because it's time for our translators to switch every half an hour.
Okay.
And this was my awareness practice. Will I be able to remember the time? And I think I did a little bit earlier, but I thought it was a good moment to interrupt. So they're just going to take a moment to switch. And are we done? Yes, we're ready. Are we ready to go?
Good to go?
Okay.
Okay.
Great,
okay.
great.
All right.
So
thank you.
Before you move into the second one, though, this courtship is another concept I love. To bring in the romance. Now, how strange is that? Courting the grief. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, we tend to keep grief at arm's length. So how will we ever know what it's asking of us, what it needs from us, if we don't have some kind of intimacy with this presence, with this quality? So courtship doesn't imply necessarily an easy connection. But it does imply that there is a connection that is undeniable. Has anybody here on this screen, or all the screens that are combined here, been spared grief or loss? No. Every one of us knows it. So how do I work with it if I keep creating estrangement from it? So courtship is kind of a contrary thought, like, why would I want to bring this close to me?
Mm-hmm.
But the closer I've brought this to me, in a sense, the more I've been able to also feel grief's companion, which is gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because they travel in a pair. You know, grief and gratitude are always there.
Mm-hmm.
I begin many of our grief rituals by saying the work of a mature human being is to carry grief in one hand and gratitude in the other,
mm-hmm.
and to be stretched large by these two presences in our life. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the courtship. Is I can really deepen my relationship to grief, and by so doing, I begin to feel into the exquisite beauty, the incredible privilege it is to be in this flesh. You know, if I deny grief, I also close my heart, and I think I become kind of superficial. If I only pick up gratitude, I won't have the capacity to feel into compassion for other people's suffering. Mm-hmm. If I only pick up grief, however, soon I will become cynical. My heart will become bitter. So I need both. You know, we need both in that courtship. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
We could talk a long time about that.
For sure.
Yeah.
And you were going on like the second thing. Yeah.
The second requirement of the apprenticeship is to develop a practice of some kind. For me, it's writing. For some people, it's yoga or meditation or prayer, but take up some practice. It provides ballast. It gives us some weight at the bottom of the ship. Mm-hmm. So when the big storms come in, we are not capsized quite so easily.
What is ballast?
Ballast in the old, well, I think they still do. In the larger ships, they would put lead in the bottom of the ship to give it weight. So when it would be hit by a wave, the weight of the ballast would give it stability. Mm-hmm. Another image that I use is called the hold fast. And when we go out to the coast here in California, but I'm hoping in many oceanfront communities, you have kelp beds. And the kelp, at the bottom of the kelp is a root that chemically bonds to the rock beneath it. And that is called a hold fast. And so when the storms come, the kelp are tossed about, but they are held in place by this bond. That's what a practice does for us. Because you're going to be hit with grief. Sometimes an intense wave of grief will come into your life. And if you don't have a practice, something that can help steady you, you can be out to sea for years before you return. Yeah. The third element in the apprenticeship is learning how to carry grief as an adult. Now, again, this one could take a long time, but I'll just briefly say that frequently when grief comes up, and I've seen this many times in workshops and in my office, when grief comes up for an individual, suddenly the adult face is gone, and I'm looking into the face of a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old who is overwhelmed, terrified, alone, and that child cannot process the grief. What the child can do is survive. And all praise to survival. You know, most of us learned how to survive, but the work in the apprenticeship is to slowly migrate the grief from the child's hands into the adult's hands. And I spend a lot of time in the Wild Edge of Sorrow talking about working with this movement called the complex. How when trauma or when grief comes into our bodies, we can be knocked out of place. And in its place is this very young part of us that's has no skill set to process the grief, whereas the adult has plenty of skills to process the grief. But that child state, just like I say, knows how to survive. So this is a long process. This is a big part of the apprenticeship, is this migration from child hands to the adult hands. Because the adult, again, has the imagination and the flexibility to process sorrow. And in the processing of sorrow, move it into into the terrain of medicine, right? That the grief I metabolize becomes medicine for those I encounter.
And that not to be confused with healing the grief. It's not healing the grief. It's grief bringing healing or medicine to our lives.
Yeah. Grief is not a problem to solve. It's a presence awaiting witnessing. So when we can witness it fully, then it can keep moving. Unwitnessed grief tends to congeal again and harden. And there's no movement then. So the apprenticeship is providing that attention, that deep witnessing, both internally but also in community, so that it can begin to soften and move again. The fourth element of the apprenticeship is to develop a relationship with silence and solitude. Now, here I am talking about the importance of community. Why is he talking about silence and solitude? Well, because much of the time that we are with our grief will be alone. So how do I turn my time alone into sanctuary? Well, that's by another courtship with silence and solitude. Silence is a kind of hospitality to those quieter voices of soul. So I grant it room and space to be listened to be heard, to be responded to. And solitude is a kind of containment field, kind of a holding space where the sorrows can gather and be acknowledged. So I'm not so busy, not so distracted, not so on to the next thing, but cultivating a ground in which grief can be held and acknowledged and listened to, which leads to the fifth requirement, which is self-compassion. In the grief book, I wrote how working with sorrow opens us up to compassion for others. But I didn't write in the book that in order to get to grief, I have to develop self-compassion. I have to feel as if my losses matter. You know, for 40 some years, I did not grieve. I was a very tight white man. And it was very hard to cry. I was taught well how not to be, cry baby. But when I finally began to feel like my losses mattered, that what happened to me was worthy of my attention, then that dam began to crack and the waters of grief began to flow. And now those tears come very readily, very often, particularly when you pay attention to the larger context of grief, not just personal losses, but the wider arc of loss. So that's the apprenticeship. If we can, pick up those 5 pieces, you're well on your way to, picking up your, apprenticeship with great fidelity. Yeah.
Right. So this is kind of an answer to how to apprentice. I think before I asked, you responded to that. So, and I already asked you, why do we need to pay attention to grief? But would it be repeating myself if I ask, why do we need to apprentice to grief? You already said a few things, but
well, first of all, repetition is valuable.
yeah,
It's actually a thing the soul loves, is repetition. Why do we go over the same stories over and over again? Right? So why do we, as children, want to hear the same story over and over again? Repetition when anthropologist, I can't remember her name right off the bat, she said repetition is a form of permanence. Why do we do the same rituals again and again?
Right.
You know, it keeps stitching things back together again that tear so easily. So why do we do, what was the question again?
Thank you for, making me feel good about repeating myself. But why do we need to apprentice to grief?
Again, I think the primary reason we need to apprentice this is that without that fluency, that movement in and out of the heart's inner chambers, we are not participating in the welfare of the community or the commons or the planet. So the apprenticeship, as all true, we could say, we can make some parallels with initiatory practices here. That the apprenticeship is not for me.
Yeah.
And the initiation is not for me.
Right.
It is to ripen me in preparation to help maintain the well-being of the commons.
Right.
That the world is sustained by a collective of caring, present, responsive human beings. That's always been our job throughout history. Why did almost every culture I've ever looked at have rituals of renewal, rituals of maintenance, rituals of grieving, rituals of gratitude, rituals of initiation, rituals of elderhood? These practices are what help to protect and sustain the community over the long walk, way beyond me. I mean, again, this apprenticeship is not for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's to prepare me. It's to use the word ripen a lot, but it's to kind of give me the characteristics and the capabilities to respond to what is moving around me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think this is what Stephen Jenkinson also calls making humans. This is how we become humans.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lovely. Well, now that we have covered the apprenticeship, I would like to touch upon the 5 gates of grief, or however many gates of grief actually. But this was something also very particular that I learned from you and your book, that the grief, we often associate grief with personal losses, personal pain, individual pain. But your work has really opened my eyes to this wide world of grief, or all these different gates and thresholds that bring us into this territory. So shall we talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I didn't, when we began doing the grief rituals, I didn't have this articulation. This is what emerged by sitting in circles over many, many years, hearing what's coming in the room and recognizing that many people were there not grieving about the death of someone close by, or a divorce, or the loss of a home or a pet. They were grieving many other things. And they began to kind of have territories. So the first gate of grief is the grief we feel for that everything we love, we will lose. That's what I call that gate. That everything that you love, you will lose. And there's no exceptions. This is a fierce gate, that to love is to accept these truths of impermanence. And again, these losses happen either through our disappearance. I mean, a lot of the grief that I've felt over the past years is my grief of those who will be left behind me when I die, how sad they're going to be about my absence. You know, that's a whole different quality of that gate is, what is my absence going to do to the people who love me? And that makes me sad to feel into their grief. And this is the one gate that is collectively acknowledged. We have funerals. We get condolence letters around if you've lost a marriage or something dear to you has departed. We get people saying, "I'm sorry for your loss." But this is the only one that collectively is acknowledged. The second gate of grief has to do with the parts of us that have not known love. And these are the pieces of us that have been shamed or denied or made unwelcome, the parts of us that we feel are worthless. I mean, every system, familial, educational, cultural, religious, have ideas on what is allowed and what is not allowed to be expressed as a human being. In my family, you couldn't express anger. You couldn't express sadness. You couldn't express joy. So the range of what I came in with was this big. What I left the family with was about this big. So all of those other pieces of me were lost. Now, the proper response to having these pieces lost to my wholeness should be grieving. But because I've also learned now to hold these parts of me with judgment, I can't grieve them. So this is what walks into my room as a therapist, are people who have experienced a feeling that they've lost parts of themselves, their tenderness, their vulnerability, or they carry a lot of shame. They come into my office, but because they have learned, as I learned, to hold these parts with contempt, there's no healing. There's no warmth. Contempt is cold. Judgment is cold. So there's no movement. There's no ability to bring these pieces back into the heart space and have them become soft again. So a lot of the work in therapy is grief work around these losses. To grieve over the fact that your sensuality was banished. Right. Your exuberance was silenced. It was crushed. You know, your tears were shamed. You know, so many of us have encountered, you know, layers and layers of that type of conditioning. So beginning to repair that relationship by bringing the compassion to these parts of us. And in a sense, a deep sense of apology. I often say we need to practice making amends to these parts of us. That we may not have caused the original departure, but we've maintained it. Right. I remember in my late 20s going back into therapy, and the first words out of my mouth to my therapist were, "I want you to help me get rid of some parts of me." You know, like if I could just get rid of these weakness, neediness, you know, sadness, these despicable parts of me. If I could just get rid of them, then I'd be, you know, nice and shiny and people would like me. Of course, he kind of laughed at that, and well, not mockingly, but he did not collude with me. And my humanness came not in spite of these outcasts. I call them outcast others. It came through them. As they returned, my humanness returned. My vulnerability returned. My willingness to be known returned. So that's the second gate of grief.
Yeah.
The third.
So in a way, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just wanted to highlight that in a way, grief work, even though it seems contrary, it's about coming back alive again, coming back to our wholeness and fullness and regaining that aliveness.
Yeah, thank you, Felice, because people have this misconception that grief is almost akin to depression. But grief, I say grief is feral. It is wild. You cannot domesticate grief. When you open to grief, you are shaken, you are moved, you weep, at times uncontrollably, you're on your knees. It's like a wild creature has come into your being. So it is not a deadening energy at all. The refusal to grieve is a deadening. That is the sediment. That is the weight of oppression. But when we open to grief, we come very much alive. So thank you for bringing that back in.
Right.
Yeah. So the third gate of grief is the sorrows of the world. So over time in our grief rituals, more and more participants are coming because of what is happening to our world. They're not there for personal losses. They're there because of what is happening to the water, to the soil, to the animals, to the extinction of species, to the silencing of languages. They're there because of what is happening to the larger body that we are, intimately entangled with. Part of what the third gate does for us is it breaks up the fantasy of separation. I tell the story in the book. In 2010, we had the Gulf oil spill here in the Gulf of Mexico, when hundreds of thousands of gallons of crude oil were being poured into the Gulf, killing untold numbers of marine life and birds. And I would wake up many nights hearing the voices of the dolphins crying, and I would just start sobbing. I'm 2,000 miles away from the Gulf of Mexico, but my soul was not. Psychically, I was completely entangled with what was happening there. So what the third gate reminds us of is there is no separation. There's no place to hide from glaciers melting and from sea levels rising and from, soil depletion and fishery depletion. There's no hiding from that. There's no separation. The third gate says this: what's happening to the larger body will be felt in your own body. And if you are willing to face that, that's part of our quickening too into our apprenticeship. Yeah. The fourth gate. Are we ready for the fourth gate?
Yeah, I was, thinking of that, but maybe I'll come back to it, and then it will be another repetition. So that's good.
Oh, good. You're getting good at this, Felice.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. The fourth gate is what we expected and did not receive. And I had no idea this was going to emerge in my working with groups, but I kept hearing grief about the absence of the village. Where are our people? Why aren't we doing grief rituals everywhere? Why aren't we gathering? Why are we so alone? And I began to hear in that lament that what we're aching for is something that we expected. We expected when we're born, we come in as R.D. Lang, the psychiatrist said, we come in, we're born as Stone Age children. In other words, we're carrying in our DNA, both physiologically and psychologically, and probably spiritually, the same expectations as our deep time ancestors had. We expected when we arrived here to be living in a community where 40 pairs of eyes greet us every morning and ask us, what did you dream last night? And to invite us out to gather wood for the fire, and that tonight there's going to be storytelling, or there's a ritual because something happened to one of our families and we need to address that, or there's the group of initiates are returning, and or we're going to be under the stars tonight, just sharing food. This is what we expected. And almost none of that materialized. And in its place is a profound emptiness. And I can't tell you how many times in my own life, but also in my practice, I've heard someone say, I feel so empty inside. And this emptiness becomes, we blame ourselves for that. Like if I had just done it right, if I had figured out the whole thing, I wouldn't feel this way.
Right.
I'd feel full. But that emptiness is not personal. It's not from personal failure. It's from the failure of culture.
Right.
To provide what it is that we expected when we arrived here. And that's what happens when we gather back into these communal settings, is something in our psyche settles and said, that's what I expected. I expected to be singing with all my kin. I expected to be on our knees, weeping side by side with my kin, and then joyously holding each other and welcoming each other back from the shrine of grief and sharing meals in the morning. That's what we expected. That's what I call the primary satisfactions. Mm-hmm. These are the satisfactions that shaped us over hundreds of thousands of years. And suddenly those satisfactions have been replaced by secondary satisfactions: privilege, rank, power, wealth, material goods, addictions, consumerism. And if you notice, those things can never be satisfied. We always want more. Mm-hmm. And because we are pursuing a path of secondary satisfaction, we are consuming the planet out of its own resource. Right. We are consuming, they say now, by midway of every year, we've already consumed what the earth can regenerate. So we're consuming a planet and a half a year now. It cannot regenerate itself to keep up with this consumptive demand for more. Mm-hmm. Always wanting more.
It's like hungry ghost.
Like hungry ghosts, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. But when we're inside of primary satisfactions, we're not wondering what's on TV tonight. Mm-hmm. We're not wondering when the new cell phone is going to come out or the new car. We're satisfied. Western capitalistic systems would collapse in a day if we returned to primary satisfaction. It would upend the whole system because we would be satisfied with each other's company and sharing food and story and ritual and song and dream.
Yeah. So my personal apprentice is at this particular gate. I've known this since I came across your work. I can point like this is where I'm, apprenticing especially, and my work is around that. And I'm so happy that brought consciousness, because to do it also unconsciously, to be at a particular grief gate and not knowing why we're doing certain things could be also self-consuming, which happened to me. I've had a burnout a while back. So, but thank you. I think it's time again for translators to switch. I'm so proud of myself that I keep count of that. Thank you. So we'll take a moment as they switch. Yeah. Tamam. Okay, we're good.
Okay.
So, yes.
The fifth gate of grief that became self-evident over time in these gatherings was ancestral grief. Mm-hmm. And the more I sit with groups of people, the more I think and feel that almost all the grief we carry is ancestral. That even if I have grief at the second gate for being shamed or told I wasn't allowed to have those parts of me alive, well, where did that story begin? How many generations back can we go when exuberance was silenced, when sensuality was shamed? So even if it's a current story, so much of it is ancestral. So a lot of the grief that we're carrying, as Rumi said, began in some other tavern. It began a long time ago. So just acknowledging that. For a lot of white European descendants who live in this country, a lot of our ancestral grief has to do with what happened when we arrived on this continent, to the native cultures here, the decimation and destruction of indigenous populations, the importations of slavery. And you see, by our failure in the United States to deal with these losses and grief, these ghosts still persist. We're still dealing with racism in a powerful way, and we're still dealing with the residue of the damage we've done to native cultures on this planet. So we haven't addressed those yet. We haven't gone into grief ritual together. We haven't begun to address these things. So they haunt us. So that unacknowledged ancestral grief is still very much a part of our times. Again, big, huge topics that we could spend a lot of time on, but those are the five. And there's people who've been working with my material over the years have added a sixth gate. And the sixth gate they called is the harm that we have done. And I think it's kind of a continuation of that ancestral grief, the harm that we have done. But they've articulated another gate around the harms that we have done to other people and to other beings and other watersheds. And that itself is another form of grief that we carry. So I like to see that the work is evolving in other hands and hearts.
Then if I can come back to my repetition question.
Please do.
There is this chapter in your book titled Drinking the Tears of the World. So for me, references to the third gate. But I wanted to ask, how is that a sacred work and responsibility actually for a mature human being?
If we are going to risk having the heart open, you will inevitably feel the sorrows of the world. You can try to hold them at a distance, hard to do, or you can become active in the process of drinking the tears of the world. The grief is not something simply to endure. It is something we must engage. We must engage it through ritual, through writing, through dance, through poetry, through some kind of ways in which we give it shape and give it expression. So when I talk about drinking the tears of the world, I'm really talking about an active participation in acknowledging what is happening to our watersheds and to our species and to the atmosphere, to all parts of our world are being affected. So if I'm going to be willing to participate in that, then I can actually respond. And we need people who are capable of responding to these times, not just enduring them, not just getting through them, but actually cultivating capacities to participate in the mending and the repair of the world. And again, we're not doing this just for myself. I know physically that I won't see the end of this walk. I won't see us to the other side of, if there is going to be a continuation of our species, big if right now, I won't see it. I will die long before that time is done. But what my job is, by drinking the tears of the world and taking up the apprenticeship, is to do whatever I can to clear the debris for those who are following behind me. To do as much as I can to help us remember what it looks like to be a human being, to widen the aperture of what it is we're allowed to express as a human being. So that's my work. That's my way of drinking the tears of the world. And I remember giving a talk up in Canada some years ago, and we were talking about this process of the tears of the world. And a young woman raised her hand and said, "So what's the answer?" You know, I said, there is no answer, but there's a response. And every one of us must decipher the response we're being asked to make. Every one of us on the screen has a particular note or particular pathway of responding to the tears of the world. And if you decide to take that into you, then you can articulate and express, like you, Feliz, and you know, you've decided that your response was to bring grief rituals back into your community, right? You felt called to do that. Well, who called? You know, what is that part of us? And that's part of that listening. What is the response you are being asked to make? Yeah. Well, if you're willing to drink the tears of the world, what's being asked of you then? How are you going to articulate your medicine for the world?
Yeah, I feel that's so important, to find our own unique way, the way our souls call to us. Today, in that particular session about the grief on this land, somebody expressed their grief about not learning their mother tongue, because that was shamed and that was not encouraged. So it could be, our response could be learning our mother tongue.
Absolutely.
It could be learning our ancestors' songs, or even learning gardening.
It could be, you know, being kind to the person in the store. You know, there's no soul doesn't care about the size of the response. Just make one. Make it a practice. You know, kindness, as the Dalai Lama said, that's his religion. You know, kindness can be your response. Compassion can be your response. Protesting in the streets can be your response. You know, writing letters can be your response. Just don't stay passive. This is not a time for passivity. This is not a time to let other people do it. You know, part of what gives me, I hesitant to use the word hope, but part of what gives me hope is to see the size of the response that's happening around the planet. Again, when we go back into individualism, we can begin to feel like this is overwhelming. What can I do? What can one perfectly inadequate human being do to change the world? I can't stop this. But when my imagination goes out, when I begin to remember the filaments of connection that I have, I'm not alone. I'm deeply entangled with millions and millions of others, not only humans, but more than humans. And there's one on the screen right now. I remember going to bed last November, before the elections were going to be happening, and I was full of despair. I was deep in despair that we would choose this person again as our president. And something stopped me in my tracks. I turned around, I went to my bookcase, and I pulled this collection of essays off the shelf by, oh shoot, what's her name? Linda Hogan. She wrote a collection called Dwellings. Linda Hogan is a Chickasaw Native American elder. And I opened the book, and the book opened to all my relations. And I realized that in my despair, I had collapsed inward on myself. And I had forgotten the filaments of connection to star clusters and the old oak on the hillside and the redwood trees and the creek running down alongside the house and the frogs. And I began to remember my filaments of connection, and the despair just dissipated.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of our work right now, is remembering our entanglement, to not fall into passivity or hopelessness. Well, actually, hopelessness is fine. Just don't fall into passivity. Mm-hmm. This is a time for courage and faith, I say. It's courage to keep our heart open, and faith that there's something rumbling underneath all of this that actually has meaning. We are entering what I call the long dark. And the long dark is not a negative thing at all. It is a necessary time of dismantling, when things erode and decay and fall apart. And the long dark might last decades or generations. But in the long dark, things happen like what happens in the root systems underground. Magic is happening in the dark. There's holiness in the darkness. And if we can have faith in the dark and participate in that through dream, through imagination, through intuition, through ritual, we can become the ones who can translate what's happening in the dark into new shapes and new forms. But right now we're in a season of decay. And it takes courage to stay open during the long dark. Mm-hmm. But I have faith that something is happening in the darkness that we can't necessarily see happening, but something is being undone and hopefully reimagined in this long gestation period of our species.
Yeah. And with that, you mentioned that, because I also don't put together grief work necessarily with dystopic projections into the future, which we might easily fall into when we look at what's going on in the world right now. For me, grief is also about really being in the present moment and being with what is. And then, the faith element is, for me, it's knowing that it's a mystery at the end of the day. We don't know about tomorrow,
don't know.
Really. Yeah.
No, we don't. Yeah.
So, Francis, is there anything you would like to finish with as we bring our time to close?
Let's close with a poem that we often close our grief rituals with. At the end of our long work, we usually meet for 3, sometimes 4 days of grieving together. And I end with a poem of Rumi, where he says, "Those tender words we shared with one another are stored in the secret heart of heaven. One day, like rain, they will fall and spread, and our mystery will grow green across the earth." So all praise to what you're doing this weekend to bring grief out of the shadows and to actually have a festival in honor of this utterly most human encounter. Every one of us will know grief. Even if we don't know love, we will know grief. So this is the commons of the soul. So thank you for honoring what is fundamental to our soul life, to our human life, and also the peace that it will hopefully enable us to sustain life far beyond these days. And thank you, Felice, for the invitation to be with you all. So
thank you, Francis. Okay. Thank you for planting the seed many years ago in me and through me and through my friends' work on this land. And maybe someday, hopefully, we can host you here in person.
That would be a joy.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Many blessings to you and to your kin and to your work.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone. Herkese çok teşekkürler. İyi akşamlar. Çok sevgiler.